If you ever drove a British car, flew in a British aircraft, or owned anything turned out by a British factory in the 20th century, some part of it was almost certainly shaped on a machine like the ones built by Matrix Churchill of Coventry. They made the machines that made everything else, thread-grinding lathes so precise the rest of the world bought them. 2,000 people worked there, carrying more than a century of skill, and 2 founding firms fused into one trusted name. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the slow collapse of the British machine tool trade that took down giants all around it. It survived 10 straight years of losses and clawed its way back into profit. And then, after 79 years, the gates on Fletchamstead Highway closed and the works fell silent. It had survived all of it, and none of that is what killed it. Not a war, not a rival, not the slow decline that buried the rest of the trade. What killed it was one deal, struck in a boardroom at the very moment the firm should finally have been safe, and it didn't fade the way the others did. It fell all at once. What was it? Chapter 1. The Men Who Measured Everything. The story begins in a small workshop in Earlsdon, on the western edge of Coventry, in the year 1913. It begins not with a famous name or a grand factory, but with an almost unreasonable ambition to measure things more accurately than anyone in Britain had thought to measure them before. The man who held that ambition was called Walter Tatlow. Tatlow was not a romantic. He was a tool man, and the thing he understood better than most was that the whole of the modern world was about to be built on accuracy. Coventry in 1913 was becoming the motor city, bicycle makers turning into car makers, sheds becoming factories, the air filling with the smell of cutting oil and the sound of lathes, and every one of those new machines depended on something invisible, parts that fitted, a bolt made in one workshop that would thread cleanly into a nut made in another, a mile away, by men who had never met. That sounds simple. It is one of the hardest things in all of engineering. To make parts interchangeable, you have to measure them, and not roughly. You need gauges. A gauge is a piece of hardened steel cut to a precise dimension, against which every other part is checked. If the gauge is wrong, everything made against it is wrong. So the gauge maker sits at the very top of the trade, the one man whose accuracy all other accuracy depends on. Tatlow set out to be that man, and he set his standard at something close to absurd for a small Coventry firm. Tolerances measured in tenths of a thousandth of an inch. To put that in terms a human being can feel, a human hair is roughly 3/1000ths of an inch thick. Tatlow was working to a 30th of that. He was making things to a precision the human eye cannot see and the human hand cannot feel in a rented workshop with a handful of men. He called the venture the Coventry Gauge and Tool Company, and at first it was barely a company at all. Borrowed space, tight money, the constant problem of every skilled startup. The work was brilliant, and the books were thin. What Tatlow had in precision, he lacked in the harder business of turning precision into a going concern. The men who can hold a dimension to a 10,000th are not always the men who can hold a balance sheet. And so the second figure in this story arrives, the one who would carry the firm from clever workshop to industrial power. His name was Harry Harley, and he was Tatlow's brother-in-law. Harley took over the management, and he had the gift Tatlow didn't. He could see the whole board, not just the next move. He had timing too, though it was the grim timing of history. On the 1st of December 1916, with the country 2 years into the worst war it had ever fought, the business was formally reconstituted as the Coventry Gauge and Small Tool Company. The war was the making of it. A nation fighting an industrial war needs shells by the million, and shells must be made to gauge, or they jam in the breech and kill the men firing them. Accuracy stopped being a luxury. It became a matter of life. And a small Coventry firm that could hold a dimension better than anyone suddenly found that the entire war machine wanted what it could do. It was in these years that the firm took the name that would outlive everything else about it. The name stamped into the steel, painted on the gates, remembered by men decades after the gates had shut. They began to trade under a single word: matrix. A matrix, in the old sense, is the mould from which other things are cast, the source, the master form from which every copy takes its shape. For a company whose whole purpose was to be the standard against which everything else was measured, it was close to perfect. Harley built that trademark into something that meant, across the whole engineering world, one specific thing: that what came out of Coventry could be trusted, down to the last 10,000th of an inch. He himself would end his career as Sir Harry Harley, a knighthood for a man who had made his name in the unglamorous business of being exactly right. Chapter 2. The Roll Call of the Best. What Matrix became famous for was thread grinding, and the whole tragedy that follows turns on understanding what that means. A screw thread looks like the simplest thing in the world. It is one of the most demanding things to make perfectly. The thread on a precision gauge, or on the lead screw that drives a machine tool, has to be cut and then ground to a profile so exact that the eye cannot detect the error and only another precision instrument can. Get it right, and you have the beating heart of every accurate machine ever built. Matrix learned to grind threads better than almost anyone alive, and then it built the machines that ground them. Thread grinding machines so good that other manufacturers, in other countries, bought Matrix machines to make their own. There is no higher compliment in the trade. The toolmaker's toolmaker. In 1936, the firm built a purpose-designed factory on Fletchamstead Highway in Coventry's Canley district, a long, low modern works laid out for the careful flow of precision work, light and ordered. Nothing like the dark, satanic image the word factory tends to summon. This was a place of white coats as much as overalls, of rooms held at a steady temperature because a single degree of warmth could throw a measurement, of men who washed their hands before they touched the work rather than after. And Matrix was not alone. The machine tool trade in Coventry in those years was among the finest concentrations of engineering skill anywhere on earth, and the historians of the city's industry would later name what they called the Big Four. There was Webster and Bennett, there was A.C. Wickman, there was Alfred Herbert, the giant of the entire British industry, whose Edgewick works sprawled across more than 30 acres and whose name was known in every machine shop in the world. And there was Coventry Gauge and Tool, the precision specialist, the one that made the instruments the others measured by. Remember the giant, Alfred Herbert. It will matter, terribly, later. Into the story now comes a second bloodline, a different firm, a different founder, a name that would one day be welded onto Matrix's own. His name was Charles Churchill, and he was an American. Churchill had been born in Connecticut in 1837, the son of a man who made auger bits, and he came to London in 1861 to install machinery for braiding crinolines, the great hooped skirts of the age. What he saw in Britain was an appetite for the new American machine tools that British industry could not yet make for itself. So in 1865, he set up as an importer, Charles Churchill and Company, and he became the man who carried the future across the Atlantic. He is said to have imported the first Morse twist drill ever seen in England, the first self-centering chuck, the first hand micrometer, the very instrument of precise measurement that men like Tatlow would build their lives around. And among the customers for his fine tools was an inventor friend of his, a man named Hiram Maxim, who was at that moment perfecting the world's first automatic machine gun. It is a small, strange detail, easy to pass over. A firm at the root of this story, supplying the tools that helped arm a new weapon, a full century before the scandal that would destroy it. The thread runs deeper than anyone making these machines could have known. Churchill put down his own manufacturing roots, building precision grinding machines at Broadheath, near Altrincham, until by the early 1960s, the works employed around 1,200 people and was bought by BSA for £8.5 million. Two firms then, Coventry's Matrix and Manchester's Churchill, both masters of grinding, both built on accuracy, both heading, by routes neither could see, toward the same destination. That destination was Tube Investments, the great holding company that gathered up so much of British engineering after the war. Coventry Gauge and Tool went in 1969, and in 1974, under a newly formed machine tool division, TI brigaded its precision firms together under one roof, Charles Churchill, the various Matrix companies, the foundries, the overseas arms, and out of that amalgamation came the name this whole story belongs to, Matrix Churchill. Coventry's gauge makers and Manchester's grinder builders, fused into a single identity, carrying between them more than a century of British precision. Years later, a Coventry Member of Parliament named John Butcher would stand in the House of Commons and try to describe the heritage of this one firm. It read, he said, like a roll call of the very best of British machine tool-making companies. He was not exaggerating. By the 1960s, Matrix Churchill stood as close to the summit of its craft as any British engineering firm of its kind. The men who worked there knew it, and the world, for a while, knew it too. Chapter 3. The Floor. To understand what was lost, you have to stand on the floor. Imagine arriving for the early shift at Fletchamstead Highway in the middle of the 1960s. You come in off the highway through the gates, past cycle racks crowded with bicycles, because half of Coventry still came to work on two wheels. The first thing you notice is that this is not a loud factory. The great drop forges elsewhere in the city announce themselves from streets away. Here the sound is different, a steady layered hum, the whir of grinding wheels, the soft hydraulic sigh of machines that moved with deliberate slowness, because precision and haste are enemies. A man could hold a conversation on this floor. He often did. The smell was cutting oil and ground steel, a clean, mineral, faintly sweet smell that got into your clothes and stayed there, the smell an old Matrix man could call back to mind 30 years after he had last walked through the gates. Underneath it, the warmth. Parts of the works were held at a controlled temperature because steel expands as it warms, and a measurement taken on a cold morning would be a fraction different from the same measurement taken on a hot afternoon. And at the tolerances Matrix worked to, that fraction was the whole game. They built the building around the measurement. That tells you everything about the place. The men on this floor were not interchangeable hands. They were the aristocracy of the engineering trade, and they knew it, and they had earned it. They had. A thread grinder at Matrix served an apprenticeship that ran for years, and at the end of it, he could do something almost no one else on earth could. Feel an error of a few 10,000ths of an inch through his fingertips. Hear it in the changing note of the wheel. See it in the way the light caught a freshly ground surface. These were not men who worked to a drawing and went home. They were men who could be handed a problem that had never been solved and be told to solve it. And who would? Watch one of them set up a thread grinding machine. He would dress the wheel to the exact profile of the thread, a job done by eye and by gauge, the diamond trimming the abrasive to a form finer than the work it was about to cut. He would mount the component, take a first pass so light it removed almost nothing, measure, adjust, take another. The whole process was a conversation between the man, the machine, and the steel, conducted in increments the unaided senses cannot perceive. And when he was done, the thread he had ground would mesh with its partner so smoothly you could turn it with a fingertip, and it would hold the world together. In aero engines, in the gun-laying gear of warships, in the machines that made every other machine. That last point is the one outsiders always miss. Matrix Churchill did not make consumer goods. It made the means of production itself. A machine tool is a machine for making machines, the lathe that turns the shaft, the grinder that finishes the gear. An economy that can build its own machine tools is a sovereign economy, one that must buy its capacity to manufacture from someone else on someone else's terms. The men on the Fletchamstead floor were not just making lathes. They were, in the most literal sense, making Britain's ability to make things. It is hard to think of work more fundamental or more quietly proud, and it is impossible, knowing where this story goes, not to feel the irony of it now, that the very thing which made these machines so valuable, the fact that they could make anything, was the thing that would carry them into the dark. By the early 1960s, a new era had begun to arrive on the floor. Matrix had started developing computer numerically controlled lathes, CNC, the technology that would define the future of the trade, machines that could be programmed to cut a complex part, again and again, identically, to tolerances no manual operator could hold by hand. They were, by every account of the men who ran them, popular on the shop floor. They had the respect of the workforce. Hold on to that phrase. The respect of the workforce. It cannot be manufactured or bought. It is built, slowly, over generations, by a firm that earns it. Matrix Churchill had earned it. Chapter 4. A Coventry Firm. A great works is never only a works, it is a web of lives, and in Coventry the web ran deep. At its height, the Coventry operation employed around 2,000 people, and in a city of Coventry's character, that meant something exact. This was not a town where a man took whatever job came up. This was a city that thought of itself as the very centre of British engineering, where skill carried status, where the question, "Who do you work for?" had real weight. and where the answer Matrix was a good one to be able to give. To win an apprenticeship, there was a thing a family took pride in. Fathers brought sons. The skills passed down the way skills do in such places, not from a manual, but from a man at the next machine, watching, correcting, expecting better than you had just done. The rhythms of the firm shaped the rhythms of the district. The shift hooter ordered the day. The wage packet on a Friday, cash, in a small brown envelope, the deductions written on the outside, ordered the week. There were the works clubs and the sports teams, the summer outings, the long service awards handed to men who had given the firm 25 years, 30, 40, men who had started as boys and would retire from the same gates they first walked through. A matrix pension was a thing you could build a life around. A great many people did exactly that, and the city around them was, for a while, one of the wonders of post-war Britain. Coventry had been bombed nearly flat in a single terrible night in November 1940, and it had risen out of its own rubble into one of the most prosperous manufacturing cities in Europe. Full employment, rising wages, a working population with real money in its pocket for the first time in the history of the British working class. Coventry men in the 1960s were among the best paid workers in the country, and they knew it, and the rest of the country knew it too. They drove cars they had helped to build. Beneath all of it, beneath the car plants and the component makers and the bright new shopping precinct, sat the machine tool firms, the foundation no one thought about, the firms that made the firms possible. Matrix Churchill's reputation reached far past the city and far past the country. Its thread-grinding machines went around the world. Its gauges and precision equipment carried that single trusted word into the machine shops of Europe, of America, of the East. When a manufacturer anywhere wanted to grind a thread to the highest standard achievable, there was a real chance the machine doing it had come from Coventry. This was an exporter, a quiet earner of foreign currency, one of those firms the country relied upon without ever quite noticing, the kind of unglamorous excellence that does not make the front pages, until one day, for terrible reasons, it does. There is a temptation, telling a story like this, to gild it, to pretend the golden age was without strain. It was not. The work was demanding, the discipline hard, and the trade had its quarrels like any other. But the people who lived it remember it, on balance, as a good place to have spent a working life. They made things that mattered, to a standard that was second to none, alongside men they respected, for a firm whose name they were glad to give. There are worse ways to spend 40 years. There are far worse. Chapter 5. The Crown Jewels. By the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, Matrix Churchill stood about as high as a firm of its kind could stand. It was a world leader in precision thread grinding, not a contender, a leader. Its CNC lathes were modern, respected, and selling. It sat inside Tube Investments, one of the largest industrial groups in the country, with the capital and the reach of a major conglomerate behind it. It carried more than a century of accumulated skill, 2 founding bloodlines fused into one name. The works hummed. The order books were full. The apprentices kept coming through the gates. Years later, when politicians were picking over the wreckage, the language they reached for was telling. This firm, said John Butcher, when it was finally sold, years on, was nothing less than the crown jewels of the British machine tool industry. The crown jewels. He meant it as the highest compliment he could pay, and he was right to. Not just a good company, a treasure, a thing the nation owned without thinking about it, the way you never think about the family silver until the day it goes missing. And yet, this is the cruelty at the centre of every story like this one. A summit is, by its nature, the one place from which every direction is down. Even at the height, the ground was shifting in ways the men on the Fletchamstead floor had no reason to fear and every reason to ignore. Across the North Sea, German makers were rebuilding with new money and new methods. In Japan, an industry that had barely existed in 1950 was learning the trade with frightening speed and making machines as good as Coventry's and selling them for less. The British trade, mature, proud, comfortable, was about to meet competitors who were none of those things and who were hungry in a way that comfortable industries forget how to be. None of that was visible from the summit. From the summit, in 1970, the view was magnificent. A great firm, a great city, a great trade, all of it apparently permanent, The kind of permanence that feels less like an achievement than a fact of nature, like the weather or the river. Generations had built it. Generations more surely would inherit it. The men who walked through those gates in the morning could not see the cliff. Almost nobody ever can. The decisions that would destroy Matrix Churchill had not yet been taken. The men who would take them were, in 1970, strangers to the firm, and in several cases, strangers to the country. The order that would carry the works into the heart of the most explosive political scandal of its age was almost 20 years away. For now, the wheels turned, the threads were ground true, and the word stamped in the steel meant exactly what it always had. Trust this. It is accurate. It is right. Chapter 6. The ground begins to move. The trouble did not arrive at Fletchamstead Highway first. It arrived, as these things so often do, somewhere else, and by the time it reached Coventry it had taken on the look of weather rather than decision, something that simply happened to British engineering rather than something anyone had chosen. Start with the other bloodline. Charles Churchill's old works at Broadheath, near Altrincham, the precision grinding plant that had stood since the years after the First War, closed its doors in 1972. The following year, the wider company went into voluntary liquidation, swept up in the collapse of the Alfred Herbert Group, the giant of the entire trade, the 30-acre colossus, the name known in every machine shop in the world. Gone, almost overnight. Parliament heard the human arithmetic of it in the flattest possible terms. Around 1,000 people made redundant. 500 skilled machine tool fitters, the report ran, now chasing 10 jobs in Manchester. 500 men, 10 jobs. That is not a recession. That is the floor falling out of a trade. And it kept falling. The British machine tool industry had been, within living memory, among the finest in the world. Now it was meeting competitors it had never had to reckon with before. In West Germany, the makers were rebuilding with new capital and new methods, government and industry pulling the same way. In Japan, an industry that had scarcely existed in 1950 had learned the whole trade with frightening speed, and was making machines as good as Coventry's, and selling them for less. The British firms, mature and proud and comfortable, had grown used to a world that came to them. That world had stopped coming. By the middle of the 1980s, Tube Investments, the great holding company that owned Matrix Churchill, along with so much else, was looking at its machine tool businesses and seeing a problem it could not solve. They were losing money, not for a season, for years. Matrix Churchill had lost money for 10 years running by the time the decade neared its end, a firm with a century of skill behind it and a world reputation, bleeding cash into a market that no longer rewarded the one thing it did better than almost anyone. This was the part the men on the floor felt before anyone explained it to them. The order books thinner than they used to be, the apprenticeships fewer, the quiet awareness that the people who owned the firm, in boardrooms far from Coventry, now regarded it less as a treasure than as a line in a ledger that would not come right. A firm that loses money for 10 years is a firm whose owners are looking for the door. And the only real question, when an owner is looking for the door, is who will be standing on the other side of it when it opens. For Matrix Churchill, the answer came in 1987, and the man on the other side of the door had come a very long way to reach it. Chapter 7. The door that opened in 1987. In Baghdad, there was a trading company called Al Arabi. It sat under the control of something called the Nasser State Establishment for Mechanical Industries, one of the great arms of Saddam Hussein's machinery for arming Iraq. And in the middle of the 1980s, with the war against Iran grinding through its bloodiest years, Iraq needed one thing above almost all others, not weapons themselves, the capacity to make them, the machines that make machines. The men who ran Iraq's procurement understood exactly what the men on the Coventry floor understood, that a country which can build its own machine tools is a country that need no longer ask anyone's permission. So they went looking for machine tool firms to buy outright. And in Britain, in 1987, there was a world-class one going cheap, owned by a conglomerate that wanted rid of it. The structure was built with care. In London, a holding company was set up, Technology Development Group, TDG, the principal procurement front of the Iraqi network. TDG created another company beneath it, TMG Engineering, and on the 23rd of October, 1987, TMG bought TI Machine Tools of Coventry and renamed it Matrix Churchill. TMG was 89% owned by TDG. Chairing the whole arrangement, sitting atop TDG and TMG and Matrix Churchill alike, was Iraq's procurement chief, a man named Safar al-Habobi. The four existing directors kept a small slice, 11%, held through a vehicle with the curious name of EcoSaber. What was paid for the firm is one of the few facts in this story the record cannot quite settle. Hansard put the price at £6.5 million. The Financial Times put it nearer £4 million through the holding company. The difference hardly matters now. What matters is what the money did. Because under its new owners, the firm that had lost money for a decade was transformed almost at a stroke. In the 1988 to 1989 financial year, Matrix Churchill returned a profit of £2.4 million, its first profit in 10 years. To the men on the floor, whose jobs had looked fragile for so long, this did not look like a scandal in the making. It looked like a rescue, a new owner with deep pockets, full order books, the works humming again. You would have to be a hard man to look at that and call it a tragedy. But look at the orders. They were substantial. Lathes worth £19 million in total, and among them a single order for 200 of the company's computer-controlled lathes to be assembled in Iraq from kits made in Coventry. 200 CNC lathes. They went, under a project the Iraqis codenamed ABA, to the Nasser and Houthi state establishments, to make parts, the later inquiries would find, for multiple launch rocket systems. And the most sensitive correspondence with al-Habobi was written in Arabic, so that the firm's own American staff, at the affiliate in Cleveland, Ohio, could not read what was being arranged over their heads. This is the hard center of the story, and there is no honest way around it. The machines were real. They were superb, and they went into the making of Iraqi weapons. Matrix Churchill was not an ordinary firm that stumbled into one bad order. By the time of the customs men in the courtroom, it was an Iraqi-owned firm whose lathes had reached the arsenals of a dictator. That is the truth the simple version leaves out, and it must be said plainly before anything else is said at all. But here the story turns, and turns in a way that makes it almost unbearable. Because the managing director of Matrix Churchill, a Coventry man named Paul Henderson, who had left school at 15 and worked his way up from apprentice to the top of one of Britain's largest machine toolmakers, was telling his own government everything. For some 17 years, on his many trips behind the Iron Curtain, and then into Iraq, Henderson had been an informer for British intelligence, passing what he gathered to a succession of handlers at MI6. In September of 1989, he sat down with officials from the Ministry of Defence and, on a wall map, showed them where Saddam's weapons factories were. The man the state would one day put in the dock had been, for the better part of 2 decades, one of its own quiet sources. So, the government knew what its machine tools were doing in Iraq. It knew because the managing director was telling it, and it kept signing the export licenses anyway. Why? Partly because policy itself had quietly shifted beneath everyone's feet. The rules, the Howe Guidelines, set out by the Foreign Secretary in 1985, were meant to bar exports that would significantly enhance either side's ability to wage the Iran-Iraq war. But after the ceasefire of August 1988, 3 junior ministers, William Waldegrave at the Foreign Office, Alan Clark at Trade, Lord Trefgarne at Defence, met that December and agreed a more liberal reading of the rules. Deliberately, the record would later show, without any public announcement. And the following November, Mrs. Thatcher told the House of Commons that supplies to Iraq were still governed by the guidelines introduced in 1985. There was a warning too, written down, from the people who should have been heard. As early as January 1988, the intelligence side had argued against pulling the company's licenses, partly because they feared for the safety of their source, and partly because, through Matrix Churchill, far more important information might cease to flow. The man on the inside was worth more than the machines were dangerous. That was the calculation. For a while, it held. A word here about the gun, because it is the thing everyone remembers, and it is not, in truth, quite this story. The Supergun belonged to a Canadian artillery genius named Gerald Bull, who had persuaded Saddam to fund a cannon so vast it might fire a shell into orbit. Project Babylon. But Bull's monstrous barrels were forged by other firms, by Sheffield Forgemasters, by Walter Summers of Halesowen, not by Matrix Churchill, whose trade was lathes, not gun tubes. Bull himself was shot 5 times outside his Brussels flat in March 1990, an assassination no one was ever charged with. The following month, Customs seized sections of his gun, disguised as petrochemical pipework, at T-Sport. The Supergun and Matrix Churchill were 2 strands of the same dark affair, arms to Iraq, but they were not the same case, and the men who would stand trial for the Coventry lathes had nothing to do with Gerald Bull's cannon. By the start of 1990 then, here was the position. A historic Coventry firm, secretly Iraqi-owned, making excellent machines that were going to Saddam's arsenals, run by a managing director who was feeding the secrets to British intelligence, under licenses a British government was signing, while telling Parliament its policy had not changed. It could not hold. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and overnight, everything that had been quietly tolerable became politically radioactive. Chapter 8. The knock at the door. They came for the company in the autumn of 1990. HM Customs and Excise raided Matrix Churchill, seized its papers, and arrested its directors. The man who had drawn maps of Saddam's weapons plants for the Ministry of Defense was now a man under criminal investigation by another arm of the very same state. There was a strange, telling detail buried in the documents that surfaced later. The principal private secretary at the Department of Trade had told Customs that an earlier visit to the firm would be used for fact-finding only, that no action would be taken without ministers first being consulted. And yet the prosecution went ahead. The intelligence community's old warning that pulling on this thread might endanger a source and cut off a flow of vital information was set aside. The decision was taken to put 3 men on trial. The company itself did not survive to see the verdict. Under the cloud of the prosecution, the Iraqi owners sold off what was left. The grinding side and the lathe side were split apart and passed to other hands. And in July of 1992, the works on Fletchamstead Highway, the long, low-precision factory built in 1936, where men had ground threads true for over half a century, closed. 600 jobs went with it. 600. Skilled people, many of them, who had given that firm their working lives, who had served the apprenticeships, won the long service awards, planned their pensions around those gates. They lost it all, not because the machines had failed, not because the orders had dried up, because of an export scandal decided in rooms they had never entered, by men whose names they would only learn from the television. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in 1992, before a circuit judge named Brian Smedley. 3 men in the dock: Paul Henderson, the managing director; Peter Allen, the sales director; Trevor Abraham, the commercial director. The charge was that they had deceived the Department of Trade and Customs, that they had claimed the machine tools exported between 1988 and 1990 were for civilian use, when they knew otherwise. The defense was simple, and it was devastating. The government had known. The government had encouraged it, and one of the 3 men in the dock had spent 17 years telling that government, in detail, exactly what was going on. To stop that defense from reaching the jury, 4 cabinet ministers signed certificates, public interest immunity certificates, to keep the relevant documents secret. Michael Heseltine, Kenneth Clark, Malcolm Rifkind, Tristan Garel-Jones. The papers that would have shown what the government knew were to be withheld from the men on trial for their liberty. Heseltine, to his credit, signed only with reluctance and pressed for as much of the truth to come out as could be managed. Judge Smedley ruled that the documents must be disclosed, and then the case came apart in open court. The defence, led by the barrister Geoffrey Robertson, forced out Henderson's links to MI6 and forced out the documents that proved the government had known all along. Then they called Alan Clark, the minister who had sat in that December meeting, and agreed to read the rules more liberally. Under cross-examination, asked whether the official account had been the whole and honest truth, Clark gave the answer that broke the trial and entered the language. He had been, he conceded, economical with the actuality, economical with the truth. A minister, in the witness box, conceding that the official version had not been the whole of it. The case collapsed. In November 1992, Henderson, Allen, and Abraham walked free, acquitted. 3 men who had come within reach of prison for doing what their own government had known about, encouraged and licensed, were free, and the firm they had run was already gone. Chapter 9. The Reckoning and What Remains. The acquittal did not end it. It began something else. Within days, the Prime Minister, John Major, announced an inquiry, to be led by a senior judge, Sir Richard Scott, into the whole affair. The export of arms and dual-use goods to Iraq, the Matrix Churchill prosecution, the use of those gagging certificates that had nearly sent innocent men to prison. It would take more than 3 years. The Scott report, when it finally appeared in February 1996, ran to thousands of pages. Its findings were measured, and they were damning. Government policy on sales to Iraq had changed after the 1988 ceasefire in a way that should have been reported to Parliament, and was not. Statements made to the House of Commons had been untrue. Of William Waldegrave, Scott found that his assurances of no change in policy were untrue, and that he had known the facts that made them so, while accepting, carefully, that Waldegrave had held no duplicitous intention. The Attorney General was criticised over the handling of the immunity certificates. Innocent men, Scott found, had been put at risk of prison. What the report did not find was a conspiracy, a deliberate plot by ministers to send blameless men to jail. It found something quieter, and in its own way harder to bear, a habit of not telling, of managing the truth, of letting a prosecution run its course while the prosecuting state knew more than it was prepared to say in open court. When the matter came to a vote in the Commons, the government survived, by a single vote, but the inquiries and the headlines were Westminster's story. In Coventry, the story was 600 families, and it did not stay on the front pages for long. The men who had lost their jobs fought a long campaign for something beyond their statutory redundancy, for some recognition that they had been casualties of a national scandal, not of an ordinary business failure. The Ex-Workers Committee had its chairman, Phil Harris, and its members, men like Tony Farrell and Rod Vernon, who kept the fight alive for years. They spoke of the things that appear in no report, the breakdowns, the marriages that did not survive the worry, the pensions frozen where they stood. The government held that it had met its obligations. The men held that obligations and fairness were not the same thing. Largely they lost. The machines had gone, the firm had gone, and the country moved on to the next scandal. Paul Henderson wrote a book about it all and called it The Unlikely Spy. Years later, in 2001, he and Peter Allen received compensation from a Home Office fund for those wronged by the justice system. The sums never officially disclosed. It was an acknowledgement of a kind that the men in the dock had been treated unjustly. It came 9 years after the dock. Go to Fletchamstead Highway today and you will find a place called Earl Place Business Park. The long precision works is gone, where the temperature-controlled rooms once held steel to a fraction of a degree, where men once felt an error of 10,000ths of an inch through their fingertips. There is the ordinary low-rise tidiness of any business estate. The former workers put up a plaque. It records simply that this was the site of Matrix Churchill, once Coventry Gauge and Tool, from 1913 to July 1992, renowned the world over for high-precision machine tools. A few words on a wall where a world reputation used to stand. And yet the name did not quite die. In Coventry, not far from where it all began, a firm called Matrix Machine Tools still grinds threads, owned now by a company from Taiwan, working in a modern factory, carrying that old, hard-won word forward into a century its founders never saw. The thing Walter Tatlow set out to do in a borrowed shed in 1913, to measure more accurately than anyone had thought to, is still, in some quiet corner of Coventry, being done. That is the strange shape of this story. It is not the tale of a firm that failed. It is the tale of a firm that was, by most ordinary measures, succeeding, profitable again, full of orders, making machines as fine as any in the world, when it was caught in the gap between what one part of the British state was doing and what another part was willing to admit. The men on the floor measured everything to a fraction of a hair. The one measurement that destroyed them was taken somewhere else entirely, in figures they were never shown, and the bill came to 600 jobs and 100 years of skill. The word is still stamped in the steel. It still means what it always meant. Trust this. It is accurate. It is right. It was the men who handled the truth, in the end, who could not quite say the same.